Hi, everyone. Welcome to Key Takeaways. Today, Maggie Bright and I are going to talk about how to pick the number of segments in your segmentation solution, which I know is an incredibly nuanced and wonky topic that will not be of interest to a lot of people. But if this is something that you're interested in, or maybe you're embarking on a segmentation, it's a really important decision. And it's hard to talk about in the abstract, but Maggie and I are going to do our best to kind of delve into some of the things that we think you should be thinking about or considering as you make this decision, and some of the pros and cons of different sizes. So we hope you enjoy and take a listen. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm here with Maggie Bright, and today we are talking about how to pick the number of segments in your segmentation solution, which is kind of a wonky topic, right? Like,
extremely. I mean, you don't hear podcasts every day that are like, hey, let's talk about something that's very niche and make it even more niche.
yeah. Do you think we're the first people ever to podcast on this?
No, surely someone else has done this.
You think someone else has done it? All right. Well, we wanted
not as well as we're going to do it, but someone else.
We're going to be the best version of this. The best version. There's probably like 5 people in the world that like want to talk about this question, but for those 5 people, we want to cover it the best we can.
Exactly, and we will, and we'll find those 5 people, I hope.
Well, our mothers are the first 2, so there you go.
I think my dad listens too, so that's 3.
Your dad would probably do a better job picking segmentation than both of us.
He really liked the inflation and spending one, so
This is one of those topics that's actually like kind of annoying because there's like 15 levels of it depends in the answer, right? But it would be a lot easier if we could just say, 8, that's the end of the podcast. It doesn't even need to be a podcast. This is a subject line email. 8.
I love it.
Here you go home, find 8. So maybe we should take a step back and talk about the process and when this decision comes into play. But as anybody who would listen to this podcast probably knows, when you go about doing a segmentation, it's like this foundational understanding of your category, or perhaps of a subcategory of your category. We can talk about more about that later. But you've got this foundational understanding of the category that should last a while and should provide your organization with like this common language around different types of customers that might use your product or service. And you go out and you kind of do all this work to figure out how you're going to build that framework, how you're going to define the category, how you're going to define your customers. And at some point, you have to say to yourself, all right, how many different types of customers do I want in my archetypes that I'm going to teach my organization? And so maybe where I would ask you, Maggie.
Okay.
Can you think off the top of your head of the biggest and the smallest number of segments you've done in your career?
I think I've gone as high as 12 or 13. Okay. For a very specific reason. I don't like that many, but there was a reason behind this.
Okay.
And then how small? I mean, I imagine there's been some B2B ones where we've had 3 or 4. But I honestly feel like a lot of times I land at 5 or 6. So the 3 and the 12 would be outliers in terms of the range. I don't know. How about you?
It's funny. I started thinking about this morning when we were going to record this. I definitely remember the top of the range. I'll talk about that in a sec. I was trying to remember if I've ever done one where we went under 4. I know I've done 4 a lot of times. 4 is actually like a lot of people like 4 because it's simple and it makes a nice little pretty pie chart. I don't think that I've ever done 3, but I was like, I'll bet you somewhere in there we have, and I've just forgotten about it. I can't remember an example of that.
Nor can I, but it feels like at some point we must have done one with 3. But I would think, I don't know. If you challenge me on that, I would probably concede.
Yeah. And you can make the argument that if you want something as simplistic as 3, you probably don't even.
Right.
There's probably an easier way to cut it that's like a little bit like not what we would typically call a segmentation. But at the top of my chain, like I don't think you were involved in this, so you may not even know about this. I was like, I'm wondering if I was like trying to think this morning too if I've ever told you this story, but
You've done research without me?
well, I just think it was a busy time, and I actually think I was okay. Maybe you do know about this, but let me see if this strikes a bell for you. We had 16 occasions by 9 segments for a
Yes,
retail.
I know exactly what you're talking about, I think.
Do you really?
I think
Wow.
I do.
Okay, so you have a good memory, but I
No,
that
but I could be wrong.
no, you probably are right because I wasn't sure if you would remember this or not because it was a while ago, but
Can I
yes,
say the category I think it is, or does that give too much away?
it's a retailer, right?
Yes, but there was a specific. I may be thinking of a different one.
We'll talk about that later, but
Okay. Okay.
that's crazy, right? And it's funny
Yeah.
there you will, especially around food. Uh, I've done a number where we cut occasions by people that can get quite large.
Yeah.
You have to have a really unique organization, a really research data heavy organization to or a very specific use case to want something that big. Um, but I think that that's by far the biggest one I've ever done. But
Yeah.
I always tell people like, look, like psychologists have known this forever. I mean, hey, even before there were psychologists, people knew that like 7 is a very magical number because it's like it's kind of the limits of our uh, short-term memory capacity is to kind of have. So I think there's always this idea that like I always try to be somewhere around. Uh, I think 5 to 7 is kind of the sweet spot in most cases where you have something that most people in an organization can understand, right? Like, and sometimes when these things get really big, when they get really small, it's very understandable, right? You're like, hey, I want something really simple. Just want to, and there's a lot of organizations that start with like very simple archetypes of like, here's the, you know, I remember this fashion one when they're like, we wanted most 3 women. They were all women. They're like, who are our 3 women? And it's like that's fine. That's actually it's good because like there you could still come up with like pretty different strategies for these 3 women, and it still gives you something to aim at. Uh, and I feel like I always would love. This is something that I'm trying to think of. Like I don't necessarily know the answer to this, but I wonder like if someone out there knows like the biggest one that's regularly used that the organization love. Like because I always think like I'm like a pretty data centric guy and like trying to keep a 16 by 9 matrix in your head.
Yeah. I don't think that anyone uses all of it. I mean, I would imagine that there is of that 16 by 9, they've identified 5 by 4 or something that they're actively talking about. And that's what I think happens more often than not, right? Because you're right. No one that I know or no normal person can aggregate all of that data and use it effectively on a regular basis. It's too much. And so if you are trying to get your organization to rally around your target user and you're like there's not just 1 or 3, there's you know 160 different permutations, and that's even not enough. I didn't fully do my math, or it's too many, but like no one can think on that level on a regular basis and communicate it. And so it becomes, not that there wasn't a reason for doing it that way, but my guess is that no one's really actively talking about all of those different intersections of consumers and occasions. At least I hope not, because that would be a long meeting.
And there's different times when different ones come into
Yeah.
focus. I did a lot of work with a tech company for many years, and I was really surprised that we had 2 segmentations for them for 2 sides of a marketplace business, and it was really interesting that they like everyone in the organization, well outside of research and even outside of marketing, everyone knew both of the segmentations really well, and they were both fairly large. I think they were like 7 to 9 each, but they were used in everyday decisions, and you would even hear like the senior leadership talk about the specific ones, and they would go on like build sprints for one particular segment or one particular need of that segment for like three to
Yeah.
six months, and it was just thoroughly ingrained in the organization. I was always really impressed by that. um,
Well, that probably speaks to the power of how well the segmentation was done, right? So if it's a good segmentation and you can see your yourself or your consumers really well articulated by that segmentation, then you're more likely to remember it and to use it and to engage with it. Um, that probably speaks to that, and then it probably also speaks to the appetite that the organization has for insights too, right? They took the time to socialize it and to have everyone get to know it, so then it becomes useful. And I think we talked a lot about that in one of our other podcasts, where it's kind of like, hey, there's certain things that you have to do to get the organization invested in the segmentation, and that probably, once you have the segmentation, no, the organization invested in the segmentation, that's hard to say, then you have more room to have more segments in a way, if it makes sense statistically still. So I think that's part of it. If you have an organization that's like, well, we should do a segmentation, but we don't know if we're really going to leverage it, then you can't bring them 10 segments at the end of the day and be like, try to use these. So I do think, organizational appetite has something to do with how well a big segmentation gets used.
Yeah. The organization. It's funny. I made a little list of like what drives this decision, right? So if you get to the kind of midpoint of the process and you have the core team and you say, okay, how many segments do we want to land on this? What's the list that drives this decision, right? And I think the
I like
organization
that.
is actually the number one thing on the list, right? It's like because there are some organizations that are very, you see this with very like strategic. A lot of times, like older companies, right? Like you see it a lot in like CPG or whatever, where the strategy is kind of baked into the approach, so people don't fight to get over the hump to learning, right? Like
Yeah.
if it's refreshed, they dive in, and I think that's a massive kind of driver of how we guide this decision. So maybe
Yeah.
not to put you on the spot, but
Oh,
if someone asked you like pros and cons of a really small solution, like what are the
okay.
first things that come to your mind?
Okay. So pros, it's really easy to remember and to talk about fewer segments than more segments, right? Like it's an easier thing to communicate. Um, and it's often simpler, so it can be, it's more accessible to more people if it's something that is more streamlined, depending on how complicated the category or the segments are. I think the cons to that is that it could, depending again on the category, oversimplify the marketplace, and therefore you don't really have sort of these more, you maybe lose some of the richness, I guess, that you can get out of the segmentation if you're lumping so many people together. And so it becomes less actionable if you want to do more targeted marketing or product development that's focused on a particular segment, because they aren't as distinguished. I mean, not that three would not be distinguished, but there's just less room to have different approaches across your customer base.
Yeah. Yeah, and with the smaller one, it's also a little bit easier to like synchronize the strategy at the end. So, if you have like a 4 segment solution, and you're like, "Hey, we're going after this segment one is the first target, and segment two is the second." Everyone's kind of aligned. It's like, okay, how do we build for segment one? Go in and really get to know like what they need. So it's easier to kind of like align on what the opportunity is and go after them. And you're talking about one thing, but when you talk about a broader group, their needs are less homogenous, right? Like you know, if you lump like, if you were to split all people into 4 age ranges, there's a big difference between an 18 and a 25-year-old in terms of needs, right? But they're all the under 25 bucket if we have a 4-way split. So
I like to be, when I have when I'm looking at solutions, this is going to make me sound like I have multiple personalities and voices in my head, but I like to be able to sort of like role play each solution and gather how they would be different from each other. So if I were introducing them to a room, like how would I describe this one versus this one versus this one? And I want to make sure that they don't feel like they're, from the same group, right? And so
yeah,
with three, I feel like there would be, like you said, there would be, I wouldn't be able to tell like necessarily really interesting things, as many interesting things about how unique they are. Whereas with five, I could have like a really great dinner party, and they would all have very different things that they were bringing to the table. And so
yeah.
that's my litmus test. It's a weird one, right? I'm talking to
No,
myself and looking
no,
at
you
data.
want people to, and it's funny though. I actually think this, from my perspective, this discussion does. We are making a couple of assumptions here as we dove right into this topic. That the assumption is that all of your different solutions that you have to pick from are all really well done, right? So like
Yes.
you have a grade 3, a grade 4, a grade 5. All the segments make a lot of sense. So we're kind of setting those assumptions aside because
Yeah.
those are really, there's
Should
an
I do
audience.
the disclaimer that it's homogeneous within and heterogeneous across so that we sound
Yeah.
sciencey?
Um, but there's still, with that being said, even if you have like a really good like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it still is a question of like where you draw the line. Um, and it's, with fewer segments, you have a little bit more variability within each segment, of course, like because you're
Yeah.
putting people in broader buckets, and so, but it's easier. You see this in politics all the time, right? Like politics for years now. Like I think post Facebook, this has changed a little bit, but they go after these really broad buckets, right? Like they go after like it's basically age, gender, uh, maybe ethnicity. Like they had these pretty broad buckets that they would attack, and they would come up with these strategies for how they were going to go after each of those buckets. Um, and then post social media, when you could do these hyper targeted campaigns, that would go at much more specific groups. But let's go to the other side of this, because I think it highlights the thing that I'm trying to say. Because I actually think this to me is the most important decision, and it comes down to what the ultimate use case for the segmentation will be. And this is a hard thing, I think, for people to understand, even people that are really kind of deep in this kind of stuff. But if you go with a big one, you have all these hurdles at the beginning, right? It's complicated, but you can unlock these groups that have like a very, very clear strategy that's very low hanging, right? Like, like if you think about food, like if you were to develop like a keto specific, you know, food product or something, like, all right, you've just eliminated 90% of the population that's not into keto. But for those people that are into it, it's a very easy sell of like, oh, I've been looking for this. There's not very much on the market that specifically hits my needs. And that's the biggest kind of benefit of going with a big one, is that each group, as each group gets more and more homogenous in what they're being defined by, the strategy to attack them becomes much clearer. But you've got 10 different strategies because you've got 10 different groups you're attacking, or how you got to go after changes.
Yeah,
Um,
but I think that's so dependent on the organizational structure too, right? Because if you're a food company and you have a keto segment, but then you have multiple different products or categories within your organization that all could go after keto, then who, like it becomes this very intricate dance of who owns the keto segment versus, should we be looking more at it from a value perspective, or like which lens should we be looking at as we're figuring out the right target segment for each category, and then the reverse of that. So I think that's another interesting thing too. We had a situation at one point where there was a very that it was a big product line, and so too few segments was bad, right? Because then you had multiple products who were really like, no, that's my segment versus the other. But
yeah,
then if you get it too nuanced, then none of the products fit that either. And so it's kind of like, where's the middle ground?
Goldilocks solution here.
What's that?
Where's the Goldilocks solution?
Exactly. And it was not oatmeal that we were doing, just for the record. But
Yeah.
or porridge, whatever she gets. But yeah, so I think that is, I think that this is where you were talking earlier. That's not like we can say eight's the magic number or seven's the magic number, because it's so dependent on what you're going to do with it. And there are different. I would think about it differently if it was an attitudinal segmentation versus an occasion based segmentation versus if I were crossing the two or adding in, database metrics that exist, because then that would, like, do we have to tie it back to a database? Because then that makes a difference about how nuanced we're going to get with the number of segments. This is a terrible topic that we picked. There's no answer.
There's this is an incredibly nuanced topic. I know. I kind of wonder if this may be too in the weeds for people that would find a research firm's podcast. But it's a really important question, right? Like it is something
No,
it's
it's
really,
crucial.
yeah. And it's something that, in my experience, most people really struggle to define the priorities. Even, even people they're really good at their jobs, or their organization does, because the natural tendency is like, if we were to say, hey, what's the primary use case for this? Is this more like a mass marketing or performance marketing, or is it more product? Or most people want to be like, well, it's got to be everything. You know what I mean? There's
Right.
just this natural thing to like, well, we're not going to do two, right? So it's got to kind of cover everything, which is where you get this kind of push and pull, um, between these different needs. So you trying to, that's why you end up in this kind of Goldilocks zone all the time between, by the way, I don't think I've ever used the Goldilocks zone before, and I've just used it twice in the last
I
minute, but
like it. I like it.
it fits in this case, right?
Trademark
Like,
or something? Are we allowed to talk about Goldilocks? Do we have an NDA with her?
no, she's probably in the public domain now. She's out there. Goldilocks is out there. Um, and the other thing too, that we I mean, I know you do this, and I know I do it too, is we sometimes will have like two versions, right? Like you have the more, like the more nuanced, like there's 12 segments here, but then they roll up for a lot of people that don't need to see all 12, they roll up into four big
Right.
buckets or five big buckets or something,
Yeah.
which is kind of an interesting approach. It's a big pain in the butt during the reporting and the initial education phase, but it makes a lot of sense. Like, and we see a lot of ad agencies do that too.
Yeah.
uh,
I think the other thing too is if you have this very nuanced and complicated segmentation solution, that might also come with a very nuanced and complicated typing tool that you then have to use in every survey that you're putting out there, right? So that's another, if I have to find 14 segments across 9 occasions, like what does that typing tool look like
Yeah, the
potentially?
identification, yeah, or the algorithm, if it's not
Yeah.
a, yeah, depending on what the use case is, yeah, then the identification of it is later. And we have some companies that, some people are real decisive, and that just, it's like, okay, we'll go with the bigger solution, but we're going to immediately knock five off the table of not
Yeah.
priorities for us, and then go at, just in the algorithm or the typing or whatever you want to call that kind of a future identification phase. you
Yeah.
you know exactly who your target is, right? And you kind of, again, that could rotate over time. You could, during certain seasons or certain times a year, or you could go after one target and then go after another a different time.
I was in a client meeting a couple days ago. We had an interesting question. We were presenting the final solution to a segmentation, and it had 5 segments in this particular solution. And the client asked, 5 segments, great, they all make sense, but they're all about the same size. So they were all right around that 20% mark. And he mentioned, is that normal? Does that make sense? And so I've been thinking a lot about, does that make sense? Is it normal? And I think it as we talk about some of those smaller solutions, like a 3 segment solution, it would obviously be problematic if you had one of those segments taking up 60% of your consumer base, and then perhaps the other two split between that 40%, whether equally or not. And so it was one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is like, how do you have to balance that part of it too, to make sure you don't have this giant segment and then 2 smaller segments. And so I think that comes into play when you're picking the number of solutions too. But you brought up an interesting point too, as we were just discussing this around like, hey, sometimes there is this great opportunity for what might be a really small or niche segment because it can have such an actionable strategic component to it. So there's sort of 2 sides of that argument as well. So would love your feedback on that.
That's the thing with all this stuff, right? Like, it's like I think the key question is like, okay, if you expand this, do you see the benefit right away, right? Like, and yeah, and I had this great story that I tell people sometimes, where we were doing this, with this, a really smart team was working on this thing, and I want to say we had like 6 or 7 segments, and there was this, if you expanded the solutions out to like 9 or 10, there was this very small group. I remember it was 5%, which is in our world is normally probably too small to make. That probably is a reason not to use that framework. But it was very clear, this was a tech company. It was very clear what they needed, very clear why they wanted it, and they were very passionate about it. And we decided, like, listen, we're going to keep this in here. And honestly, that one like when we presented that one little 5% was so clear what they needed to do to get them. They went out and did it in like a month, and it actually made like their whole next 2 years, just because they that audience was like a really passionate audience, and bringing them in, they're also a very vocal community. Bringing them in, making them happy was actually a really easy thing to do, and it was just something that no one who worked at that company, this is like a turns into like almost like a diversity kind of speech. No one who worked at that company was part of that 5%, so never really thought about what they might need. But it's just adding it was, they're like, oh wow, like they're really happy. That's all they needed. You know what I mean? So there are cases where I think you go up. There's a clear benefit to going up, but I generally try to push these down. I try to simplify, because I do think that for most of the users, whether it's external agencies or different teams in the organization, you want as few as possible. But there are times I do have a few stories too of doing a large segment for similar reasons. Like the large segment can help you, especially um if it's a large segment of people that are probably not going to be your target. That actually simplifies the whole thing. You know what I mean? Like, like I've done that before, where we like will make solutions where we say, okay, look, these people may have a lot of differences among them, but one thing they're all in common is we're not going to get them. So let's just put them in this one bucket, call it, and then we could have more detail around who we do want to get, right? Because that's where the work is anyways, and that's where. So there are examples of that. Although I think in the vast majority of cases, we are looking for reasonable size segments that that most of the time, we're talking about the kind of the edge cases here more so than the
Well,
other ones.
I mean, I think if obviously the numbers and the data is going to drive the recommendation around how many segments we think a company should move forward with. But in I feel like in the ideal world, if someone was like, what would your ideal design look like for a solution? I love the idea of 5 to 6 segments with 2 to 3 priority targets, and then 1 or 2 secondary targets that sort of frames up the way forward. And because to me, that feels really manageable. It's this idea that, yes, there's diversity among our consumers. And we can see that they fall out into these 5 to 6 distinct groups. And then we can focus on, 2 to 4 of those groups. That's like a really manageable conversation to have in terms of understanding who the segments are, targeting strategies, really connecting with a core group of consumers. And so, I mean, if there was an ideal world in which it could come out, I'd love to see them when they come out that way, because I think it's really digestible and actionable. But I don't know. Maybe they come out that way a third to a half of the time, and then the rest of the time it's more complicated than that because it needs to be.
Well, it's interesting, because I actually like what you brought up here, because so we've been talking this whole discussion about how many segments there's being total, but really what you focused on is like how many targets should there be, right? So, and that's actually really interesting. Like if you have like if you have like say a great 5 segment solution with only 2 targets, I always go back to the rule of 3, right? I love 3: primary, secondary, tertiary. What are like 1, 2, 3? What are we doing from this? I love the idea of 3 targets, even though no one is going to be. In almost always in these things, there's one that's the very clear target, and usually they're the one that we know going in, right? We knew that this was the target, but then a secondary target and a tertiary target make a lot of sense to me as a reason to expand out.
Yeah,
Um,
agreed. I like the
the
idea
other
of a stretch target too. I don't know if that is always the tertiary target, but this idea of like, well, we have these customers that we love, or these users, or whatever the right terminology is. But then there's this group that we really want, and that's our aspirational target too. And I think that's a fun conversation to have around how do we reach those, because then it takes you in a slightly different direction potentially with long-term strategies.
Yeah, it's funny. You kind of started. You went one direction, and then you kind of turned a little bit
That's
mid.
common for me.
That's very common. I've learned that. But it's interesting, because you actually started to go. The first thing you started to say before you got into the how many should there be is, how do you make that decision, right? And I do think it's interesting to talk about this. We talked about it a little bit earlier in the podcast, but it's actually hard for people to make this decision. it's hard in life, right? Like if somebody says like, what's your priority, your career or your kids? It's like, well, I don't know. I can't rank those things. But like, I do think that
It's
like,
always for kids.
oh, really? Wait, am I supposed to pay attention to those kids?
In case
Just
they
kidding.
listen.
Joke. Cut that. Just kidding. So, but I do think that there is like, you could make this list. I actually really try to push people early in this process. A lot of times I'm just annoying them. They don't understand why I'm pushing this, but sometimes, hopefully, in my goal by the end of the process, they get what I was like trying to push the discussion on early on, because I think it's a hard discussion. But like, what is the priority here, right? Like, these things can get so complicated, right? Like, are we trying to cover the whole category, or are we doing a subcategory? Like, like this is your world too, but you get into like retailers or food, and they might have a whole like segmentation just for Halloween, right? Like, Halloween is a big deal. It's legit.
Yeah.
So like, are we? But that is not the same as like how decisions would be made year round. So that's a subcategory of a category,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So and then that plays into it, right? Because in a subcategory, you probably could go into a little bit more detail, right? Because these are the people engaged in this are probably maybe more engaged. But what is the organization like? Like we know this too. Like this is one of the things, like as on the consulting side of this business, if you're going to be any good at this, you have to learn to try to learn an organization from the outside is actually a really hard skill. Like, is this an organization that's, likes things kind of simple and well designed and polished, or is this an organization that likes to dive into like huge spreadsheets and quote exact numbers and details? This is an organization that likes things to be kind of stylistic, or is this an organization that likes things to be kind of like get into the messiness? Are they more writing? Are they so you have to understand where the organization is, because if you have like a really polished management style kind of organization, and you give them like 12 segments that are super wonky in how they're defined, that could be a problem. And I think the use case is often the hardest one. That's what I mentioned earlier. Is like, is this something that's going to be used organization wide and is more of a terminology thing, or is this something that's got like a very specific performance marketing goal attached to it? And we because those things will all drive how you could make this decision.
Yeah. I think that we had talked about this in a different podcast. That's the importance of doing the stakeholder interviews and understanding, hey, how are you actually going to use this? So and potentially solution review workshops before the final solution is selected, because there are often multiple potential solutions that you could move forward with, and it's the business. It's not just about the numbers, right? It's about the business need that then drives the final solution that you select and the number of segments within that solution. And I think that's really hard to understand, because it's like, well, wait, there's 3 potential solutions that I could pick one, and then within that there's multiple layers. It's really I think actually that's a really fun part of this, right? Is that we get to come in and say, hey, this solution gives you, these types of levers to pull, and this one helps you solve for this component that you wanted to solve for. And kind of understanding the pros and cons of the final solution you pick is a really fun part of our job, because not only do we get to talk about how they work, but we get to learn more about the companies that we're working with and what they're trying to solve for, so that we can make a good recommendation. But I love that part of the process. That and the naming of the segments, which is always fun.
All right. I feel like we've probably talked more about how many solutions to pick than anybody would care to listen to. But when in doubt, just go with 7. Okay, that's what if you don't want to, you can fast forward to the end of this and be like, when in doubt, 7.
It's funny because we teased everyone by saying 8 in the beginning, and now we're downshifting. I would actually maybe go lower, like 5 or 6. This is really the number.
Okay. All right, you're team 5. Yeah, this is like Twilight.
I'm going to be team 6.
You're going to be team 6. Okay.
Yeah, it's my lucky number.
Okay. Is 6 really your lucky number?
Yeah.
Really? How did I not know that? I just learned something. This is big. I didn't know your lucky number.
Every jersey I ever wore on any team, there was always a 6 in it. So either 6 was the preferred, and then 16 and 26 were acceptable.
That's so interesting. Well, maybe it's my birthday's the 26th, so maybe that's
well, there you go.
Maybe that's like a numerology thing.
I don't know why 6 was a favorite number. I have no idea. I think it has no, it's not tethered to anything in my life. I don't think.
So 32 is my number, but I don't think I want anyone to pick 32 segments.
Right. I mean, yeah. So that's kind of a crazy favorite number too.
It's just because of Magic Johnson and Sandy Koufax. That's it. It's all Magic's fault.
You need a lower, maybe 5 should be your number because 3 plus 2 is 5.
Oh wow. Wow, look at you just going deep here.
I spend a lot of time thinking about numbers for reasons I can't explain.
So you'll appreciate this. This has I don't know why I'm telling you the story, but so my son is playing football right now, and technically his his number is 2, but they somehow the person who was making the jersey I think thought it was a 5. So I don't know if you could picture in your head. So, but if you turn a 2 around, it's not a 5 or a 2 anymore. It's just this weird. You almost have to draw it and then do it to yourself. But it's really funny because you
So
can
is
see
it backward too?
yeah, so it's like one of those they iron the number on the jersey or what I don't know if it's ironed anymore. That's what we did as a kid, but yeah, you attack and someone did it wrong, and it's like, but it's really kind of messes with your brain because people you could see people staring at it for a second. They're like, "You're 5, you're 2," because your brain kind of knows it's a 2 or a 5, but it doesn't really fit either one. It's really
What
funny.
are those tests called? Right when it writes it'll write blue the word, but it's done in purple and it messes your head up.
Thank you. That was my undergrad dissertation was
What's
all
it
on those.
called though? I can't think of what it's called. That's it.
I had to do like 200 people through those tests. I had, and back in the day, like I'm old now, but it's not like we had like a little PC that would do that. We had to program this thing. It was like it was crazy.
So if you go to the Spy Museum in Washington D.C., they have one of those. I don't even know how it relates to anything, but it's there. They have one of those tests that you do, and I think it's still pencil papery. Like it's not it's not automated, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong about that, but maybe it is your dissertation that they have on display at the Spy Museum.
It could be. It could be. I highly doubt that since I don't think I don't think my dissertation made it anywhere very exciting.
Yeah, but anyway, that has
I
nothing to do with segments, and
I was
maybe
telling somebody this story the other day, and I feel like there's very few stories I've never told you, and I don't even know if this belongs in the podcast. We'll let Nicole decide that. But I did my undergraduate dissertation. So I was a cognitive science undergrad, and they had this program where they would let like a small number of people could apply, and you had to do a dissertation in your senior year, which basically helps you get into grad school in your junior and senior year. And you work with like these professors and their grad students. And so I got put on this cognitive science memory researchers team. This woman, she was very nice. I really like her. I'm not going to say her name in case anybody looks this up, but I had to meet with her like every Tuesday. And like doing even when you're a grad student, doing a like a thesis it's a lot of darn work. You work on them for 2 years. I think mine was like 75 pages long. It's like a little small book.
how in the world did you get 75 pages on the color blue written
Oh,
in purple?
it was such a pain in the butt. But anyhow, this woman who was my advisor, she again was very, very nice, but she kept cases of warm Budweiser under her desk and she wanted everyone to drink with it. It was like Tuesday at 2. She'd be like, "You want a beer?" And I'm like, "No,
A
I don't want
warm
a beer."
beer?
I can't believe you want warm Budweiser in your office. And she would but meanwhile, we're talking about the most wonky memory type cognitive functions and trying to write about them. And I was just like, I'm like, what am I doing with my life? Like, it was really brutal. So that I think but the only reason I bring that story up is to tell you that I think my brain just kind of like blocked out a lot of that stuff. I can't even remember now the name of my dissertation. For many years of my life, I carried the little like floppy disks around with me that have all that stuff on it. It's probably in an attic somewhere. I should try to find it and be like, what was the topic of my thing? I don't even remember the title.
You wouldn't be able to put it in anything. Like
I know. Where would I even put the floppy disk? I'd like go into like a 7-Eleven and wave it in front of the credit card machine.
was it the 5-inch floppy or the 3.5-inch
No,
floppy?
I was cool. I was the 3.5-inch floppy. I was the hard plastic kind.
How many times did you erase said 3.5-inch floppy? Because I erased many of those in my college days.
I was like always paranoid about stuff, so I probably had 17 floppies that are all
Yeah,
backups.
no, I was that person who had like them all at the bottom of my backpack with a magnet.
I was telling somebody a couple weeks ago. Remember when like the new version of Windows would come out and you would get it, and it would be like 29 floppy disks, and they'd be like, "Insert disk 1, insert disk 2."
I found in my desk when I was moving all of these discs that were from some computer. It is an entire bag of them. And I can't bring myself to get rid of them because I'm like, what if I need to back up my Windows?
By the way, can you just picture Nicole's face right now as we're talking about floppy disks on a podcast about how to use your segment? Nicole's like, you guys are the biggest idiots I've ever met.
Literally, I'm just laughing. It's like, oh, actually, you know what it's for? It's for a Dell computer, which I don't even have a Dell computer anymore.
That's probably from 2013. I have that same box. I have a box of all that stuff.
What do you do with it? And all the cords, like I have so many cords and I'm like, I just can't bring myself to get rid of it. The other thing though, they've never been open. So clearly I never use them.
You need to block out an hour on your schedule this afternoon and go turn that Marie Kondo woman on Netflix. Be like, sorry, does this bring you joy? Does this bring you joy, Maggie? Let it go.
It doesn't bring me joy, but I'm afraid that if I get rid of my HP printer drivers, that I'll never be satisfied in life. What if I have a printing emergency and I can't get online?
All right, we've officially run out of topics to talk about here with segmentation.
This isn't even the right printer. I don't even own this printer.
Garbage. Tell Martha you got her a new frisbee.
Do I have to shred it? Like, what do I do with it?
I don't think there's too many hackers that want your HP printer drivers.
You never know. You never know what secrets are on the HP driver's disk. And actually, my computer doesn't take discs, so they're useless anyway.
Anybody that made it this far, we love you and thank you for listening.
Exactly. Thanks, Mom.
We love you, Maggie's dad.